Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, How are the Syrian conflict and the refugee situation affecting trafficking in persons in Syria and in the neighboring countries? My name is Elisa Trossero. I am the head of the Anti-Trafficking program in ICMPD and I will be your host today. For those that do not know us, the International Center for Migration Policy Development, ICMPD, is an international organization that works in migration. The organization is based in Vienna, and as you can see from my window, we have a beautiful sun today. I hope it's the same in your country. And the purpose of ICMPD is to promote innovative and sustainable migration policies and to provide our member states and our numerous partners worldwide with an in-depth knowledge on all aspects related to migration governance in the areas of research, capacity building, and migration dialogue. This webinar today is part of our project Assessment of the Impact of the Syrian War and Refugee Crisis on Trafficking in Persons that is financially supported by the US State Department to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. What we want to do today during this 2-hour session with you is to examine a very often overlooked aspect of the war and the refugee crisis, which is trafficking in persons or trafficking human beings. We will be using the terminology, we will use both terminology today. At ICMPD, we believe that combating trafficking is an integral component of the humanitarian response to war and displacement. And we also believe that the first step in combating trafficking is to understand it. And in this context of the Syrian war and refugee crisis, addressing vulnerabilities to trafficking, but also protecting trafficked people, as well as prosecuting traffickers, is not only part of our responsibility to address the trafficking phenomenon, but it will also help to alleviate the desperate situations of these people in general. That's why I'm particularly pleased to have here today and to introduce the two speakers of today's session, Grazia Giammarinaro and Claire Healy. Grazia is the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, and most of her work at the moment is focusing on responding to trafficking in persons in the context of conflict. She just returned back from New York, where just a couple of days ago, she addressed the UN Security Council on this specific issue. The second speaker of today's session is Claire Healy. Claire works with us here in ICMPD in the Anti-Trafficking program, and she's a research officer. She is also the author of the study Targeting Vulnerabilities, that you can see here, the impact of the Syrian war and refugee situation on trafficking in persons. This study covered Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, was published in 2015, and is also available for download on our website. Before giving the floor to my colleague Elena that will guide you through the technicalities of the webinar, I would like just to remind you three main issues related to our session today. First of all, that this webinar is recorded and it will be available on demand after the live session on the story file link that you can see on the main slide on your screen. Also, what is important for us is to learn from you during today's presentation. So we would like to ask you to first use the chat option that you can see on the right side of your screen to interact among yourselves and with us. And also in the questions and answers session to use the raise hand button, and Elena in a second will explain you how to do that, to take the floor and ask your question. And at last, we would also like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks and with other parties and engage in further discussions. We will be tweeting live from our Twitter account, which is at ICMPD_THV, and also using the specific hashtag for this webinar, which is hashtag TIP, T-I-P _Syria. Now, Elena, I would like to ask you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, for introducing me. For the participants, I am Elena Petrescu. I work as a project officer in the ICMPD Anti-Trafficking Competence Center, and I would like to present to you some useful webinar tips, specifically for those who joined the webinar for the first time. Now that you have joined the webinar, I would like to explain again how can you use the buttons that you can see in front of your screen. You will see the presenters on the video as you're seeing me now in the corner and also on a large screen. And you will also be able to see the presentations as you are seeing this slide now here. In case you want to send a message to the presenters while they are speaking regarding the content of their presentation, or to the hosts regarding the technical issues, please use the chat option below while the presenters are speaking. The chat window is visible for all the participants attending the webinar, but you might also initiate a private chat by clicking the name of a person that you want to chat privately with. For the technical and quality purposes, only the speakers and the presenters will be able to use their microphone during the presentations. Your microphones will be muted. However, you will be able to pose a question, initiate a discussion, or interact during the question and answer session. And that you can do by raising the hand button, which is on the top of the screen. Please also don't forget to enable your audio settings. You can do it by clicking on the microphone button that is on the top of the screen. Now the microphone button is most probably for all of you white, and you have to make it green. And afterwards you can raise the hand, and the host and the presenters will give you the floor to speak. In case that all participants' questions cannot be answered during the webinar, we will make sure to answer those questions afterwards via chat, because the chat option, as we said, will be open an hour after closing the meeting. You can also, on the drop-down menu on the top of the screen where you can see the raise the hand button, you can also select too slow or too fast button to indicate that the presenters are pacing too low or too slow or too fast. And in addition, you can also select applause or louder to express your emotions. After the closing remarks, and now at the beginning, you will be asked to answer a simple question on how satisfied are you with this seminar by clicking on one of the multiple choices that will be given in the poll. As Elisa said before, we would like to encourage you to use the social media for expressing your impressions and opinion about this webinar by following our Anti-Trafficking Competence Center on Twitter and using also the specific hashtag for this webinar, as Elisa said, hashtag TIP Syria. Thank you. Elisa?
Thank you, Elena, for this introduction. I hope you are still with us, and I see that there are newcomers joining. So let's get started by filling in everybody. We have around, at the moment, 40 participants, and we would love to hear from you where you are coming from. So we would like to launch now a poll. I am going to be quiet for a moment while you are going to read through the choices and make your selection. We would love to hear, really to hear where you are coming from, so just please click and cast your vote. Well, I see that we have about like about 20 countries represented for the moment. So I invite all of you to have a very active participation and engagement in the discussion. From what I can see from my screen, I see that there are so many participants from ICMPD key partner countries in the EU, but also in Southeastern Europe, from what I'm seeing. I think there is also somebody from Brazil, which is one of the countries with whom we work a lot. So we are happy to have you online, and we really value your participation. And I see that also some of you are coming from the countries that were participating in our study, Targeting Vulnerabilities. So I would like to warmly invite also all of you to share your experience and expertise, because for sure you will also have a lot to share specifically related to the discussion today. And I also would like to wish Ramadan Mubarak for all our Muslim participants. So thank you very much. I see that there are more people joining. So for those that are joining now, I would like to say again, welcome. And you are participating in the webinar, How are the Syrian war and refugee situation affecting trafficking in persons in Syria and in the neighboring countries? Maria Grazia, Claire, I see that you are online. So I would like now to pass on the floor to you, not before a brief introduction though. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker of today, which is Maria Grazia Giammarinaro. She is an Italian judge. We have been working together for the last 15 years, Maria Grazia, where you actually back then you were one of the key experts that were involved in drafting the Council of Europe Convention against trafficking human beings. Then Maria Grazia in 2006 joined the European Commission, the Director General for Justice, Freedom and Security in Brussels, where she was responsible for trafficking human beings and sexual exploitation of children. And then in December 2009, Maria Grazia was appointed as the new OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings. And Maria Grazia, during your mandate, you have been very outspoken about the need for unconditional support for trafficked persons in order to really have a truly human rights-based approach. And in your work, you also broadened the scope of the fight against trafficking towards like more preventive work, focusing, for instance, on decent working conditions and also social inclusion. And Maria Grazia, in her past, but also current position, has been able to raise a relevant issue at a very, very high political level, including the need for access to justice and effective remedies, including payment for compensation for trafficked persons, and now focusing specifically with the issue of trafficking in conflict situations. Maria Grazia, I am delighted to give the floor to you. Thank you.
So it's true that we have been working together for 15 years now, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. In fact, I'm very grateful to ICMPD for paving the way to a better understanding of this linkage that you are right has been overlooked so far, the linkage between trafficking and conflict. And in particular, today we focus on the Syrian conflict.
Maria Grazia,
yeah?
I am sorry to interrupt you. We would like just kindly ask you to start your webcam. You have to enable your webcam. All the participants can see you. Excellent. Now we can see you.
Okay.
Great. The floor is yours.
There was something missing in the procedure, but anyway, it's okay now. So I was saying that actually it is a linkage that is there, unfortunately, not only concerning the Syrian conflict, but recent studies, including the ICMPD study, but also the IOM recent report on trafficking and conflict and disasters, the report of Caritas Internationalis. All these pieces of work show that trafficking is not something that, you know, can happen. It is not a mere possibility in conflict situations and in post-conflict situations, but it is a direct consequence, something that happens on a regular basis. And if we think about this, it is quite clear that this happens, and it happens all the time. Why? Because, of course, in a situation in which instability, the collapse of the rule of law, displacement of people that you know are deprived of any social and family support, all the situations of vulnerability, marginality are exacerbated during conflicts, and new vulnerabilities emerge of people losing their job, losing their homes, etc. So all this situation is a situation with, I would say it is the perfect situation to be exploited by traffickers. And this, in fact, happens. When we think about the Syrian war, we see that trafficking flourishes in a way which is visible and causes enormous suffering. First of all, I would like to focus only on 4 aspects, but I would like to say that these are not the only ones. The first aspect is the situation of sexual violence, sexual slavery and sexual exploitation affecting women kidnapped by terrorist groups, armed groups, by ISIL, by Boko Haram in Africa, but ISIL has the same modus operandi. Women kidnapped, women, for example, belonging to minorities such as the Yazidi minority, but not only, are kidnapped. Some of them, it seems that they are sold on the internet. Some of them are at the disposal for foreign fighters. Seems that this modus operandi is becoming systemic for Al-Qaeda, for ISIL, for their affiliates, and there are recent books, publications, testimonies showing that the situation of these women is really horrible. I have read recently a book published by a journalist in Italy called The Woman Soldier of the Caliphate. Of course, we cannot be sure that 100% that everything is true, because this is the testimony of a woman, not a victim, but a woman joining ISIL, joining her husband, foreign fighters for ISIL, and being part of the so-called moral police, which means that they were those luring other women on the internet to convince them to join, pretending to be lovers, and they were in charge of controlling sexual slaves. And this woman, again, I cannot sure that every word is true, that she reported that some of the women implored her to kill them, and they were kept in slavery, completely naked, because there had been cases of suicides. The girls used sheets to commit suicide. So we are talking about something incredibly cruel. And I was briefing the Security Council a couple of days ago, and many delegations insisted on the idea that sexual exploitation, sexual slavery, sexual violence is becoming, of course, not only a gross human rights violation, as it is in any part of the world, but also a sort of tactic of war and terrorism. And this is, of course, the aspect that is directly linked with the mandate of the Security Council, and following the US presidential declaration of December 2015, now I think that the Security Council is really thinking about establishing a true agenda to prevent and combat trafficking in conflict situations. Another aspect I would like to mention is the situation of women in displaced families or social communities. I visited Jordan recently. I had the opportunity to meet people in camps, and I was informed about the fact that the situation of the risk of early marriages and forced marriages is very high. Of course, we cannot exclude that some girls are really sold by their relatives. But in other cases, this is rather sort of a negative mechanism of coping with the situation of war and displacement. In other words, in good faith, some parents think that it is better that their daughters get married with men that can take them away from the situation of displacement, poverty, camps, etc. But unfortunately, I've heard also that there are men coming from foreign countries, but also men from Jordan, going to the camps especially to get married with girls. Unfortunately, the destiny of these girls is not known, but we have indications showing that some of them end up in servile marriages, exploitative marriages, or in forced prostitution. Because, of course, a situation of an arranged marriage with a foreign man in a situation in which there is no possibility to have social and family support can very easily result in exploitation of prostitution. And of course, this is also the case of the so-called temporary marriages, which want to give a sort of appearance of legitimacy to a practice that is just forced prostitution and trafficking. Third aspect is the situation of the Syrian refugees not in camps. You know that in countries that have had generous policy toward Syrian refugees, such as Lebanon, such as Jordan, a minority of refugees are in camps. The vast majority are spread in the society. And these societies are after all, not very affluent. Some people live at the limit of survival. And there are situations, I've heard about situations of people ready to work for no salary in agriculture, for example, just to have the opportunity to be accommodated in a place in which they can live, can stay. Also, child labor is an outcome, a consequence of the situation of displacement. And of course, I know very well that these countries, Jordan in particular, I have had the opportunity to know better that situation. Jordan is actually welcoming so many people, thousands of people. And it is a country, it is not a rich country. And of course, this situation should be dealt with an approach of shared responsibility at the international level. So I don't want to underestimate the difficulties, but I want also to say that sexual exploitation is there. Sexual exploitation of vulnerable people is there, and it will be there if something very effective, if the international community is not ready to do something very effective in this field. And I go to the last point, last but absolutely not least, which is the situation, the vulnerability to trafficking of people fleeing a conflict zone, a conflict situation. And of course, we see that there are so many people dying in the Mediterranean Sea. So many children have lost their families. The Italian public opinion has been struck by the situation of these children losing everything, losing their mothers, the entire family at sea. Some of them will be adopted in Italy, but these are only a few cases of a situation that is there since a long time, and unfortunately we cannot expect that this will diminish. This should be seen as a global humanitarian crisis, which means that every country should do their role, should play their role, should take their part of responsibility. And this approach is not there, unfortunately. International cooperation failed, mostly failed, at the European level and at the global level. But the destiny of those surviving their perilous journey, and we have to think that this journey has become more and more expensive and hazardous. There are Syrian families selling whatever they have just to pay for the travel. And what happens when they arrive in a transit country or in a country in which they want to establish themselves? They are completely vulnerable. They have to survive. The whole family need to survive, and they are in a situation in which they are ready to accept everything, to accept any proposal of work in any exploitative condition. I have to say that here in Europe, we don't have the perception of this link. I was yesterday, I participated in a very important judges summit under the leadership of Papa Francesco, discussing a two-day meeting, discussing extensively anti-trafficking legislation, anti-trafficking jurisprudence, and these are for sure people of goodwill, people really caring for victims and trying the best way to protect victims and their rights during criminal proceedings. Still, it is not clear that the people we will encounter, we will have next to us, or we will see as victims in courtrooms, could have, and more they will have, a war, a conflict background, which means bombing, which means displacement, torture, persecution. So I think that this awareness that, you know, we are not talking about something distant, something which does not affect our life on a daily basis. We are talking about something that must be considered part of our life, part of our landscape. And when we see this this kind of tragedy, this kind of humanitarian crisis, a global humanitarian crisis, I repeat, we need to mobilize moral resources, political, legal, but also moral resources. I'm absolutely I cannot understand actually the complete lack of even human compassion in the words of many politicians and in the behavior of one part. I hope a minority of the public opinion in European countries. Of course, we need to activate energies of solidarity and see trafficking as it is, a social economic question, economic issue in which there are enormous interests involved, especially in the labor dimension, but as we have seen also in the sexual exploitation dimension. And therefore, everybody has to play a role to ensure trafficked persons' rights, to prevent risks of trafficking, and to ensure that our societies are more fair. Thank you. So I have to deactivate the camera, I think. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Maria Grazia, for this very good speech. I mean, you raised so many issues related to these new situations of vulnerabilities and marginalities, as you said. And I think in these four aspects that you highlighted, you really touched the core of this issue. And I particularly also would like to underline what you mentioned about the international cooperation, both at the EU and global level, and the fact that sometimes there is a lack of human compassion, and there would be a need to mobilize several different resources. You talked about moral resources. I think your presentation raised really many important aspects that should be further discussed. And unfortunately, Maria Grazia will have to leave us soon because of other engagements. So I would like to open the floor now for the questions and answer session. We will be able to take 3 questions for Maria Grazia if our schedule allows it. So I would like to invite all the participants to feel free to ask questions. Please, on the top of your screen, as Elena explained to you, you see the raise hand button. So kindly press it, so it will be easier for me to see who has a question, I will give you the floor. I would like to ask you to very shortly introduce yourself and try also to be concise in your question or intervention or comment. So I'd like to open the questions and answer session. If you have any question regarding the technical details, please use also the chat function that I see is already quite active on the bottom right side of the screen. So let's see if there are some hands raised. It looks either that the connection is very slow or we have many shy participants. Yes, I see one. I have a weakness, which is my capacity in pronouncing names correctly, so I apologize already now for some misspelled or wrongly pronounced name. I see Cleo Mainike raise the hand, so please introduce yourself, and I will collect 3 questions and then give the floor to Maria Grazia. The floor is yours, Cleo.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well. Very
okay,
well.
awesome. Okay, awesome. My name is Cleo, you pronounced it correctly. I'm still a student. I'm doing a bachelor at the moment, and I'm writing my thesis on the connection between forced marriages and temporary marriages and human trafficking. So it's not directly related to conflict, but I was just wondering, because no one else raised their hand, if Mrs. Giammarinaro could maybe tell me, because what I understood from what she said is that she sees temporary marriages generally as human trafficking, whether she thinks that's the case or whether there are any lines she would draw, because I assume there are also some marriages which are concluded without the exploitation as an element. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleo. Let's see if there is another courageous participant that would like to ask one more question to the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking. So if it's not the case, I would like to ask to Maria Grazia to answer the question to Cleo, and I might have one question for you after you answer to Cleo. So Maria Grazia, the floor is yours. Please activate your camera as well. And the microphone, we can't hear you.
Does it work now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you and see you very well.
Okay. I was saying that we talk about trafficking when there is an exploitation component and at least abuse or violence or fraud. These are the combination of elements that make it possible to consider a case as a trafficking case from a legal point of view. In the case of temporary marriages, I would say that for what I have known concerning what I am aware of, there is always an exploitation and abuse component because the girl is married with a man just for the time the man decides to make use of the girl for commercial sexual exploitation or to give others access to the body of the girl for different reasons. For example, in the case of foreign fighters, it is just a way to reward and at the same time to entice other young men, other people to join a terrorist group. So in this case of temporary marriages, I would say that an abusive and an exploitative component is always there. It is different for arranged marriages that can result in an exploitative situation or not. It depends on the situation and the intention of the man asking a girl in marriage. But the problem is that this girl has no possibility of protecting herself if something goes wrong. And this is the reason why I've heard about a good practice in Jordanian camps, which is, which involves UNHCR, the civil registration government department, and the religious court, and together they are informing the families about the risks. So they basically try to discourage the practice of, especially of early marriages, and of course also forced marriages for sure, to make aware people that also arranged marriages in a situation which is a situation of social isolation can be particularly dangerous. And in any case, they register the marriage so that the situation of the person, of the young woman, can be tracked, can be identified in the coming months. Otherwise, the destiny would be completely, of the girl would be completely unknown. So I would say that even though not all these situations amount to trafficking, there is a high risk that they end up in a situation, result in a situation of exploitation. Elisa. Ask a question?
Thank you, Maria Grazia. Hope you can see and hear me. Yes, I actually have two questions, since I see that our participants are listening, but they are shy in asking questions. And you mentioned four main aspects of vulnerabilities, and three mainly are particularly relevant for women. I wanted to ask you if you could maybe mention, also based on your recent visits to Jordan and other countries in conflict, specific different factors that are specifically contributing to vulnerabilities of children. So which kind of forms of child trafficking are taking place in countries in conflict? Thank you. Please just enable your microphone as well.
Okay. Vulnerability of children is actually very high in these situations. There are different, of course, different, personal and family factors. The situation of isolated children losing their relatives, their parents, their families in the war, of course, is the most most dramatic. But there are other factors. For example, in situations of displacement, it is very easy that children become the primary breadwinners for the whole family. Because for children, it is easier to work in the informal economy. and they are preferred, of course, for many reasons, but not surprisingly, because they can be paid much less than adults. In these situations, the risk of child labor and even the worst forms of child labor is very present, is very significant, and this concerns not only neighboring countries where Syrian children are displaced with the whole family, but very often children on the move, traveling alone, and trying to reach European countries through very dangerous routes, and they find themselves in situations in which they are exposed to any kind of exploitation, be it sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, exploitation in forced and organized begging, etc. This is not a situation only of children coming from conflict zones, because we know that, for example, there are many Egyptian children traveling alone toward the EU countries, but it is also true that this can last. This situation of vulnerability can last after a conflict very long, for a very long time. We still see children traveling alone, coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, or camps in neighboring countries, traveling alone, trying to in time. The hope is to resettle in time the whole family in host country, preferably in a country of the European Union. And of course, the challenge is very high, because this particular vulnerability is actually exploited by traffickers very often. I take this opportunity to say that in Europe, and I saw that there are many participants from European countries, in Europe we have a duty, we have a task, important duty, to promote, of course, to promote, if possible, more at least less restrictive migration policies, because the migration policies of European countries are part of the problem, are not part of the solution, because they increase vulnerability to trafficking of so many people. But more particularly, we should ask that in every reception center, in every hotspot, in every point in which refugees, people fleeing conflict, arrive, specific procedures are established to assess international protection needs, child protection opportunities, trafficking protection on the basis of the legislation on trafficking, because so many people, when they arrive, have been already trafficked. They are already in the hands of traffickers and exploiters, and to assess risks of trafficking, because even though they are not trafficked yet, the risk of falling prey of traffickers there in the country of arrival is very high. So we should shift, I think, the attention concerning the linkage between trafficking and conflict, should shift the attention on prevention, and we should find, in cooperation with civil society organizations, and unfortunately not all the hotspot reception centers, administrative detention centers for migrants allow civil society organizations to enter and to talk with with migrants and refugees, we should fight for that, because we need to assess and to prevent, if possible, trafficking before exploitation takes place.
Thank you, Maria Grazia, for this observation. I fully agree with you. Actually, there is a consultation ongoing at the EU level with DG Home to provide input for the post-2016 anti-trafficking strategy. And different organizations have been asked to provide also input to also the new, let's say, situation that Europe is facing, specifically related to migration flow. So we as ICMPD have made exactly a recommendation and a proposal that goes exactly in this direction that you just raised, to assess the risk of trafficking in the hotspot, in reception center among the refugees. I have one more last question for you, because I see that you have to leave, and I don't see any hand raised among the participants, which is maybe also a bit of final thought from your side to conclude your participation here today. You talk about the need to mobilize moral resources. And I would like to ask you, in your capacity as a UN Special Rapporteur, what would be your advice for policymakers, for instance, to do more in this aspect? How they could mobilize more, also, for instance, the public opinion, to have a different and a more a better understanding of human trafficking, specifically linked to conflicts and crisis situation. Thank you, Maria Grazia.
Does it work?
Yes,
can you hear me?
We see you and hear you well.
Okay. You are touching upon a very, very sensitive issue. Unfortunately, in many countries, politics is failing, absolutely failing in playing a positive role in this landscape. Of course, we know that one part of the public opinion is concerned, is worried. What politics, what we can call the high-level politics, should play a positive role in the sense of showing that these people are not dangerous for European societies. On the contrary, if we focus on trafficking risks, we show, and politics should show, that these people are at risk. They are at risk. So instead of fostering a sort of obsession about what we can lose in accepting, in welcoming people fleeing conflict, of course, we should understand that we should help. We should prevent from trafficking from happening. We should ensure that fair living and working conditions are in place for these people. So, in other words, there should be a complete shift. We should be able to overturn, the approach concerning migration and refugee flows this moment. Unfortunately, this has become very, very politicized. But I think that there are countries that are doing their best more than others, and I think we should follow these examples. I have to say, for example, that you know, the Italian the role of the Italian Navy is still very significant in saving lives. Again, an international shared responsibility approach should be stronger in this field, and it should be stronger also in the field of relocating people fleeing conflict. It is incredible that an option, which is the option of hope, is completely disregarded when everybody can see that this option would be the only way out if we ourselves were in a situation in which we can become victim of a bombing anytime. So I think that this kind of idea is what I evoked when I talked about moral resources. We should think that everybody has been a migrant in some moment. Every country, every family has known, has experienced war and migration, and it would be easy to think what the aspirations and hopes were in that situation, and try to just to be to have a solidaristic approach with people that are now in the same situation. I'm so sorry that I have to leave, and I wish you fruitful and a successful continuation. Thank you.
Maria Grazia, thank you very much. We really appreciate that you took part in this webinar. Your contribution, as usual, has been extremely valuable. And I hope there will be the possibilities to get in touch soon, and also try to coordinate our work with your office in the future. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon again, either via webinar or in a conference around the world. Thank you, Maria Grazia.
Thanks a lot, and I'm sure that we will have further opportunities to work together also with the participants.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. And on this note, I would like now to introduce the second speaker of this today, Claire Healy. She is a research officer here in the ICMPD Anti-Trafficking program, and she is also the author of Targeting Vulnerabilities, the Impact of the Syrian War and Refugee Situation on Trafficking in Persons, which is a study that covers Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. This study that you can see here, and you can also download on our website, is the outcome of an ICMPD research project that was actually coordinated by Claire herself. And we are very proud to have published this study, because the study is the first of this kind, which examines the patterns and the characteristics of internal and cross-border displacements in the war, since the war broke out, and also focuses on the reception arrangements in the hosting country. Claire has been working with us in ICMPD since 2011, and have coordinated a number of research projects, as well as also co-authored migration studies, reports, books, academic articles on various migration and trafficking issues. Claire was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Lisbon University Institute, and acted as an advisor at the Portuguese government High Commissioner for Immigration. In 2016, She was awarded a PhD in migration history by the National University of Ireland, Galway, and Ireland is also her Heimat. So Claire, it's with great pleasure that I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you very much to all participants for taking the time to join us today. So I'd like to take this time now to briefly first outline the methodology of our research, and then to share with you the main findings, followed by the recommendations that we developed based on these findings. But first of all, and I think the Special Rapporteur's introduction really gave us an overview of the kind of situations we're dealing with. At a more detailed level, I would like to share with you now just first some very concrete examples of the kind of cases that we came across during our research. The first case is a case that took place, was reported to us. It took place in Syria itself. And one of our interviews was with a Syrian activist who had been detained in a women's prison in Syria in 2012. And so she told our researcher, Syrian prison guards were observed in the prison sexually exploiting migrant women who were former domestic workers. There were 3 rooms full of foreign domestic workers, mostly from Ethiopia, Sudan, Malaysia, and Thailand. They thought they were going to the Gulf countries, but they were trafficked to Syria and they didn't have their passports. In prison, they became prostitutes to be able to buy food. The high-ranking police officers were the pimps bringing the customers. So here you have migrants from outside the region who were in Syria when the war broke out, and then based on that vulnerability were exploited within a prison. So the next case was reported to us from Lebanon, where men from the Gulf Cooperation Council states, so the states in the Arabian Gulf, traveled to the Akkar region in Lebanon to marry a Syrian girl through an irregular marriage. So the Special Rapporteur already mentioned these kind of cases of temporary or tourist marriage, muta or mishar in Arabic, and divorce takes place some weeks or months after the marriage. Obtaining the divorce is easy as the marriage is not legalized. So here we have a clear case of what we termed in the study trafficking for sexual exploitation by means of forced marriage. So it's using this temporary form of marriage in order to sexually exploit girls. The next case then that I wanted to share with you is from the years 2013 to 2014, where it was reported that some Syrian refugee children were involved in smuggling of goods and people and selling items at the side of the main road in Zatari camp in Jordan. So Zatari, as many of you probably know, is one of the biggest refugee camps in the world. You can see an aerial view of it here. In this case, however, there really was a response. The Jordanian authorities, together with UNICEF and UNHCR, and other organizations then addressed this problem and tried to reach a solution to protect these children who were being exploited in labor exploitation and in criminal activities. So it's a good example of identification of the issue and a response. The final case that I wanted to share with you that was reported to us from our research in Iraq involved a 14-year-old Iraqi Yazidi girl who was sold several times among members of Daesh, of ISIS, for the purposes of sexual exploitation and abuse after being taken from her family in the Sinjar region in northern Iraq. Then after 3 months of severe abuse and exploitation, she escaped during the coalition bombing of Daesh in Raqqa in Syria and managed to contact surviving members of her family in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So this is just one example of, we know that there are many, many cases like this that also have been, to a certain extent, reported in the media. So just to give you a little bit more information about our project, the title of the project was The Assessment of the Impact of the Syrian War and Refugee Crisis on Trafficking in Persons. The project has been running since October 2014. It'll actually end now at the end of this month. The countries that we decided to study were Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. This was based on the magnitude of displacement. So in order to understand the effects of the war and displacement, we wanted to look at those 5 countries that really have the most displaced Syrian people. The project was funded by the US Department of State, Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and we implemented it in ICMPD. It was a very international team with our entire project team based in Vienna, in Skopje in Macedonia, in Istanbul, Southeast Turkey, Beirut, and Amman. Briefly then, just to give you an idea, and of course in the questions and answers I can give you more information about this, but to give you an idea about our methodological approach. We used an interdisciplinary methodology using various different research tools in order to obtain the information that we needed for our analysis. We combined both desk research and field research. So the desk research was conducted at a regional level and at a national level, and then in each of the 5 countries under study, we had country researchers conducting field research, speaking to research informants, and then conducting enough interviews until we had reached the point of theoretical saturation, which basically means that we weren't obtaining any new information, and we felt that we'd obtained as much information as we could. It's very important to note in relation to our methodology that we did not directly interview refugees and other vulnerable groups, trafficked people, and internally displaced people themselves. This was for 2 reasons. One, we have a very large displaced population, a very large vulnerable population. It's extremely difficult under those circumstances to really interview a representative sample of people. The other issue was, this is an urgent situation and we wanted the research to be complete and published, and the findings disseminated and the recommendations implemented as quickly as possible while still doing valid research. So we didn't think that there was time to really do those kind of interviews in an ethical fashion, and so we preferred to conduct interviews with people who were at one remove from these populations, who work with these populations on a daily basis and have access to the information. So then our analysis was based both on qualitative and quantitative sources. There are very few quantitative sources available, so trafficking data or whatever, but we also analyzed them, and then we triangulated these different sources. So no one source was considered authoritative. We compared different sources in order to conduct our analysis. The chronological scope of the research, we wanted to be able to understand the effects of the conflict and displacement. So we have, first of all, a baseline period, which is the decade before the war broke out in Syria. The baseline date for our study is the moment when the war broke out, but we wanted to understand the situation in the previous decade. So we covered that decade, and that then we compared to what we referred to as the impact period. So the years from when the war broke out until we published the study in December of last year. We looked at sources on migration, forced migration, internal displacement, trafficking, any other relevant data and information that we thought would be useful for the purposes of our research. One thing to note is that, of course, when it comes to the baseline periods, we really only had access to secondary sources, to desk research, while for the impact period we were able to conduct interviews and find more primary sources. Nevertheless, we considered it important to cover the baseline period so that we don't, maintain that all of the trafficking situations and the vulnerabilities that we found suddenly emerged out of nowhere when the war broke out. But in fact, some of them were there in existence before the outbreak of the war as well. So this is really in order to determine the actual effects of the conflict and the displacements. So briefly then, just to outline for you what our analysis showed for the baseline period. In terms of origin countries here, we're looking at countries in South and Southeast Asia, principally, and East Africa. These are trafficking victims who were identified in our 5 countries under study during the baseline period. They were largely from outside the region, the people who were identified. The countries involved mostly India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and Somalia. In the case of Turkey, then the routes are slightly different. Many of the trafficked people identified during that period in Turkey were from Eastern Europe, from CIS countries, and people were also trafficked from North African countries, particularly Egypt, to Lebanon and Turkey. Because, of course, of the conflict and the situation in Iraq during that period, there were also cases of internal trafficking of Iraqis within Iraq and trafficking of Iraqi refugees in the other countries under study. For Lebanon as well, there were some identifications of people who had been internally trafficked. And then to a much, much lesser extent, you had isolated cases of Syrians identified as trafficked in the countries under study during that period. The forms of trafficking then that were in evidence during this baseline period were particularly, and again, these are registered, trafficking victims who were actually identified, not necessarily everybody who was trafficked during that period, but most cases identified involved sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and labor exploitation through begging. Also trafficking for domestic servitude, there was a high level of identification, and to a slightly lesser extent, forced marriage and exploitation in armed conflict. There were then also isolated cases of trafficking for illegal adoption and removal of organs. So this is just to show that some of the forms of trafficking that we see now in Syria since the beginning of the conflict were also in evidence before the outbreak of the war. It's just that their incidence has increased. On the other hand, as we'll see, there are some new forms of trafficking that have emerged as a result of the conflict. So moving then to our impact period and looking at the situation at the end of last year, within Syria, the level of displacement is quite high. It's over 1/3 of the Syrian population. The current estimate is 6.6 million, but particularly in the case of internally displaced people within Syria, these figures will really always remain an estimate. The situation is very dynamic. It changes on a daily basis. Aid agencies, it's the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and UNHCR who are involved in service provision to these populations, but not all internally displaced people have access, and so these will always be estimates. But as of the period when we published the study and now the estimate is 6.6 million just internally displaced within Syria, and you can see the different governorates in which they are displaced here on the map. What's really important to note for the context in Syria as well is the difficulties. One, the difficulties of moving around within Syria, and secondly, the fact that people are subject to multiple displacements. Most Syrians who are displaced have moved more than once, and each time, of course, they're becoming more vulnerable. So, for example, a research informant for our research in Turkey told us about a group of Syrians who had just arrived in Turkey from the Aleppo governorate. They said, we moved from Aleppo to Idlib, then to Homs, then to Qamishli. We fled from the PYD, so the Kurdish forces, Daesh, the Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime. We had no strength to run any longer, no bread, nothing. So this is a situation where people are becoming very vulnerable even before they leave Syria, if they also intend to leave. And also to move around within Syria is very difficult, it's very dangerous. So this is an internal movement, it's not migrant smuggling, but because it's dangerous, people still need facilitators. And so throughout the research, we referred to these people as facilitators of internal movement because they're not smuggling people across borders, but they can, in certain cases, also exploit people who are trying to move or traffic them based on this vulnerable situation. In relation to migrant smuggling, it's really important to note that during our impact period, 2011-2015, for the vast majority of that time, the neighboring countries, the hosting countries, kept their borders open for Syrians fleeing. So the majority of border crossings were regular. So again, there was no need for migrant smuggling in this case. It was a regular crossing. At certain times and for certain reasons, there were also irregular crossings, but the majority of the crossings were regular. So when Syrians then cross the border, we look at the international displacement or cross-border displacement during the impact period. As I mentioned before, we chose our countries under study on the basis of the magnitude of displacement. The figures for the end of last year show that Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq hosted 86.7% of Syria's refugees abroad. This was followed then by various European countries, by Egypt, and by other countries in North Africa. The situation has changed slightly since then, with more Syrian people arriving in European countries. However, because the numbers have increased so much, so dramatically in Turkey, as we'll see in the next slide, the proportion hasn't changed dramatically. So Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, the 4 hosting countries that we studied, are still hosting around 85% of all Syria's refugees abroad. So, looking at our countries under study, these figures refer to October of 2015, when we were finalizing the study. At that point, there were 1.9 million registered Syrian refugees in Turkey. By now, the latest figures show 2.74 million registered Syrian refugees in Turkey, so a very dramatic increase. In Iraq, the numbers have decreased slightly from 250,000 at the end of last year to now a little less than that, 245,000, of course, because of the security situation in northern Iraq, where most Syrians had taken refuge. In Jordan, the numbers have increased slightly from 630,000 to now about 645,000. Lebanon is a very specific case because the registered numbers right now stand at just under 1.1 million. But the Lebanese government instructed the UNHCR to stop registering any new arrivals of Syrians in May of last year. So this means that this particularly applies for Lebanon, but also to a certain extent to the other countries, that a number of Syrians in those countries are not registered, so they're not covered by these figures. Therefore, the true number of Syrian refugees hosted in these countries is actually even higher than these numbers. So to look then at the actual effects of the conflict and displacement and trafficking, in order to understand the situation, we wanted to view it from the perspective of the vulnerabilities of people affected by the conflict and by the displacement. So we first of all examined factors that cause people to be vulnerable to trafficking, or cause people to be vulnerable in general to various human rights violations. So the general humanitarian situation, of course, is critical. As we all know, many people don't have access to basic means of survival. This is particularly acute within Syria, but is also the case for certain groups in the hosting countries. There are issues related to legal status, also a lack of migration alternatives, as the Special Rapporteur mentioned, for those who want to move outside the region. It's extremely difficult and dangerous. For children, there are various issues in relation to child protection, particularly the incidence of child labour and early marriage in this context. For women and girls, there are also vulnerabilities related to discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence. In Syria, of course, because of the lack of rule of law, because of the lack of a state at the moment, there are severe gaps in any kind of an anti-trafficking response or any kind of access to justice. But this is also an issue to a certain extent in the hosting countries. And there is also an impact of this high level of displacement on hosting communities themselves, in the regions where a lot of Syrians have settled. So these general vulnerabilities that relate to the overall situation, in some cases cause specific vulnerabilities to trafficking in persons. So the humanitarian situation, for example, leads to impoverishment, a lack of a regular legal status can mean it's impossible to have access to income generation. Sexual and gender-based violence or discrimination means people can become involved in survival sex or other kinds of in-kind transactions, corrupt transactions. Because of a lack of access to justice, people can accept or be stuck with poor working conditions, and so on. So what we tried to do then was not to assume that all of these vulnerabilities actually cause trafficking cases, but rather to set out the general and the specific vulnerabilities, and then to look for indications that trafficking might be taking place, various forms of trafficking. Of course, it's only law enforcement in each of these countries that can definitively determine that a case of trafficking have taken place. But the information that we collected and analysed was indications and indicators of where this really, there's a case that should be further investigated by law enforcement, by protection services, because there are very convincing indications that trafficking might be taking place. One specific vulnerability that I wanted to come back to, because it really is a key finding of our research, it's extremely important, is related to both the legal status of displaced people and their legal authorization to work. So in the countries under study, none of these countries apply a UN Refugee Convention refugee status to Syrians fleeing the war. Iraq, Lebanon and Jordan have not ratified the Refugee Convention and Protocol, and Turkey has ratified the Convention and Protocol but doesn't apply refugee status to people from outside of Europe. So this means that in all those countries, Syrians fleeing the war have a more temporary status. Throughout the period that we studied, up until the end of 2015, adults were generally not allowed to work, which left them with no access to income generation in very vulnerable situations. What's very welcome is that since January, Syrians in Turkey have been entitled to apply for a work permit. The Turkish government issued a work permit regulation for those under temporary protection in January of this year, which is a really welcome development. In Jordan, there are also measures where it's being considered how Syrians might have access also to the labour market there. This is an extremely welcome development for us. This is one of our key findings, that a lack of authorization to work regularly was leading to vulnerability to exploitation and trafficking, both for adults and for children whose parents were not working. Not having a legal status also affects access to services. So there is access to temporary forms of international protection in these countries, but sometimes it's difficult to obtain that if you don't have an entry stamp for crossing the border, if you don't have proper ID documents from Syria, and sometimes it can be difficult or expensive to renew that status. So people at a certain point become irregular. This might also affect internal movement in certain countries where Syrians who don't have a regular status are restricted from moving around within that country. It can also be difficult to then move and seek refuge elsewhere. I know of one case of somebody who received a humanitarian visa outside of the region but wasn't allowed to leave Lebanon because his status was irregular. Also, when a status is irregular, people are less likely to report abuses, and all of this leads to general vulnerabilities and specific vulnerabilities to trafficking. So moving on to the actual cases where that we found indications of an increase in the incidence of certain forms of trafficking. So as I mentioned in relation to the baseline period, many of these forms of trafficking were in evidence already before the conflict began, but there has been an increase, or there are indications that there has been an increase in the incidence. This applies to trafficking for forced marriage, trafficking for sexual exploitation, these cases that I mentioned of sexual exploitation by means of force or temporary marriage. It also applies to child trafficking for labour exploitation and child trafficking for exploitation through begging. What's also interesting to note is that sometimes it's not an increase in incidence. In the case of trafficking for sexual exploitation in some contexts, for example, where before the girls and young women who were exploited in prostitution were from Ukraine or Russia, in Lebanon or Jordan, for example. Now the sexual exploitation is taking place in the same context, but the victims are now more likely to be Syrian. Then there are specific forms of trafficking that have emerged as a result of the war. These are particularly in evidence inside Syria. This is the case for, as the Special Rapporteur also mentioned, sexual slavery, forced marriage, and exploitation in armed conflicts perpetrated by Daesh or ISIS. It's also the case for trafficking for forced marriage and armed conflict perpetrated by other parties in the Syrian wars. There's also evidence of other groups, including militias allied to the regime, Islamist groups, rebel groups, who have perpetrated forced marriage and exploitation in armed conflict. It also applies to exploitation in terrorist activities. I think this is an area where we're just beginning to collect data and start to understand this as a possible form of trafficking. And finally, within Syria, and it's debatable whether these are really forms of trafficking or more related to war crimes, but kidnapping for ransom and military forced labor is also in evidence. One of the principal conclusions of our research, and it's important to be very specific about this and to really clarify what we mean, is that a lot of the trafficking that is taking place is at a very low level. It doesn't fit with the normal classic organized crime paradigm. So we often think of trafficking in persons as a transnational crime, a crime committed by a transnational organized group or a network of hardened criminals. What we found, not in all cases, but in many cases in this research, was that it was taking place at a much lower level. These were cases where, according to international law and according to national law in the countries under study, they could be seen as trafficking. But they were perpetrated by mothers and fathers exploiting their children in labor exploitation or forced marriage, uncles and aunts, neighbors, landlords, really not transnational organized criminal networks. In some cases, it has to then be acknowledged that the exploiters themselves were in a situation of desperation with no viable alternatives for survival. This is particularly the case for forced marriage, sexual exploitation by means of forced marriage, child labor exploitation in agriculture, and child exploitation in begging. So while, of course, this is a severe violation of human and our child rights, in the case of the victims, we do feel that we have to be a bit more careful in the response in relation to the perpetrators, who in some cases really are in a very difficult situation themselves. What we also found is that much of the trafficking taking place is not across borders. As I mentioned, there's very little migrant smuggling taking place within the region. That is an issue once people want to leave the region and move onwards towards Europe. But much of the trafficking taking place is internal trafficking, so not necessarily related to the migratory movement itself, but rather trafficking targets vulnerabilities that are caused by the displacement. So once people have been displaced multiple times or in a situation of desperation, that's when a trafficking process begins. And although they might be outside their country of origin, so for example, a Syrian in Jordan, they are trafficked within Jordan rather than across a border. That's many of the cases that we're seeing as a result of the research. If you were to analyze only the official statistics and the official data, you would be under the assumption that, first of all, there is not so much trafficking taking place, and secondly, that very few of the victims are Syrians. This has changed slightly in the past year or so, where in the hosting countries under study, Syrians are starting to be identified as victims of trafficking, but still at a relatively low level. However, once we did our qualitative research and we did our field research, we found indications of a much higher level, a much higher incidence of trafficking of Syrians, unfortunately. This is due to a low identification of particular forms of trafficking. So trafficking for exploitation in begging, for example, or forced marriage is not often identified as a trafficking case. It's also, in some cases, among stakeholders due to a lack of knowledge on trafficking and a capacity to identify and respond to trafficking cases. In many cases also, victims would be afraid to report. So Syrians commonly would be afraid to report a crime to the authorities in the hosting country, because if their status is irregular, they would fear arrest, detention, or deportation. In cases of trafficking for sexual exploitation, there might be a stigma attached to being a victim of that crime, or simply because they might be in a situation of labor exploitation, but they have no alternative in terms of income generation other than to earn a very, very low salary, and so they don't actually leave the situation of exploitation. We found a number of child protection issues that leave children more vulnerable to trafficking and also lead to actual child trafficking cases. Many children within Syria, but also in the hosting countries, are out of school. Children born to Syrian parents since the outbreak of the conflict, it's very difficult for them to have birth registration. This causes them to be more vulnerable, have a lack of access to basic child rights, and causes possible statelessness also in the future. In addition, a lack of legal status for adults. So when adults don't have access to services or to income generation, this also impacts children's access to education. And then in the context of this particular conflict and displacement, there is a relatively lower level of unaccompanied and separated children. There's humanitarian agencies are reporting a higher level of family reunification, which is to be welcomed. But still, of course, it's worrying that many children are still in a situation of being unaccompanied or separated from their parents or caregivers, and there's a lack of durable solutions for those children, which leaves them very vulnerable to child trafficking. And then finally, in terms of the key findings, if you look at the map here on the screen, you see that not only are there very high levels of Syrians displaced in the 5 countries under study, but they're also concentrated in particular areas. So Turkey is now the country in the world with the highest absolute number of refugees, with over 2.7 million Syrians, and the majority of these Syrians are concentrated in the southeastern provinces, so particularly Gaziantep, Şanlıurfa, Hatay, and Kilis. In Syria itself, most of the displaced people, internally displaced people, are in the north of the country. Lebanon then, as a result of the Syrian crisis, has the highest per capita level of refugees of any country in the world, so a country with a smaller population and a very high level of refugees. In the north of the country, and particularly in Akkar and Bekaa in Lebanon, there are higher concentrations of Syrian refugees. The same applies to northern Jordan, and in Iraq, most of the refugees have settled in the Kurdistan region, the semi-autonomous region of northern Iraq. So this causes vulnerabilities not only for the displaced people themselves, but also for host communities in terms of access to services, access to the labour market, and can, in certain cases, cause tensions between the communities. Although it's good to note that these have been very isolated cases so far, but it's important to address these vulnerabilities, both of displaced people and host communities in these regions, in order to avoid these tensions becoming more severe. So finally then, and thank you very much for your patience and concentration in sticking with me through this, the recommendations that we propose on the basis of these findings are more general. We also wanted to discuss these with other stakeholders to really make sure that our recommendations respond appropriately to our research findings. The recommendations that we make in terms of combating trafficking specifically is to address this form of low-level trafficking that I have explained to you. Also to focus on really proactively identifying the trafficking of refugees and providing protection to refugees who are trafficked. We also recommend addressing these forms of trafficking directly related to the war, so exploitation in armed conflict, forced marriage, sexual slavery, and to make sure to cover internal trafficking in anti-trafficking policy and initiatives, so to not always focus on cross-border trafficking. When it comes to reducing the general vulnerability of people in this context, we recommend specifically providing access to regular employment and regularization of legal status. As I mentioned, it's very welcome that these recommendations have already, to a certain extent, been acted upon. This needs to be combined with investment in the host countries, that the host countries really are overwhelmed at this point. So it's not viable to have access to regular employment and regularization of legal status unless there is investment in the host countries and legal channels for settlement outside the region. It's also important to guarantee sufficient funding and fair distribution of aid, particularly within Syria, but also in the host countries. Right now, there continues to be a shortfall in funding. What the Special Rapporteur mentioned, which I hadn't mentioned yet, is that the majority of all displaced people in this context are not living in camps. So within Syria itself, it's less than 15% of internally displaced people in official camps. In Iraq, it's just over a third, but in Turkey at this point, I think it's less than 10% of Syrians are in official camps, and in Jordan, it's around 17%. So if we focus our aid and other services only on official camps, it'll be difficult to access all of those refugees living among host communities. In Lebanon, of course, there are no official camps at all, so all of the Syrians in Lebanon are living among host communities. And finally, in terms of general vulnerabilities, we need to also address the vulnerabilities of host communities if we're going to have any kind of an effective and sustainable solution. The final set of recommendations then refers to specific groups who are particularly vulnerable in this context and specifically vulnerable to certain forms of trafficking. So for women and girls, it's essential to continue to combat gender-based discrimination and reduce the risk of sexual and gender-based violence. For children, it's absolutely essential to ensure that we have procedures and policies in place to ensure birth registration and access to schooling as basic child rights, as well as in order to reduce the risk of trafficking. Syrian citizens are not the only people who have been displaced by the conflict and by the violence. So for Iraqi refugees who were in Syria when the war broke out, for migrant workers who were in Syria, for stateless Syrians who are Kurdish or Palestinian refugees, it's important to have specific measures in place to make sure that our response doesn't only cater to people who are Syrian citizens. And finally then, of course, for refugees and internally displaced people who don't see a possibility to remain in the region, we need to significantly expand legal channels for settlement to avoid these irregular migration routes, leaving people at risk of various violations, including trafficking. This is also essential to ease the burden on the hosting countries, which right now are hosting, as I mentioned, 85% of all Syrian refugees abroad. So finally, of course, I would recommend that you also look at the full study. The study is called Targeting Vulnerabilities because we found that traffickers in a very cruel way target people's vulnerabilities to profit or benefit from abusing their rights. But as policymakers and practitioners, we must target vulnerabilities in a positive way. And this is where we and also all of you participants come in. We need to identify these vulnerabilities and alleviate them to prevent trafficking, exploitation, and other abuses, and to increase people's resilience and provide alternatives to trafficking situations. So we're now, as I mentioned, in the final phase of our project. We are communicating, discussing our findings, discussing and adapting the recommendations at regional and country level. We've been having a series of workshops in the countries under study. You can see here one workshop we held in Beirut at the beginning of April. We then want to move quickly along to implementing the recommendations. And this is also, of course, where all of you participants come in. We don't recommend conducting further research on this topic because we think it's urgent to now respond to the findings. However, in other regions, particularly the Western Balkans and the European Union, we think it would be important to replicate our methodology for other transit and destination countries because we're lacking data on the situation there in those countries at the moment. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and your questions.
Claire, thank you very much for this very detailed presentation. We have been working together on this project. I have heard you presenting several times already the study, but every time I find it so interesting, and you also managed to really captivate the attention of the audience. So it was so informative. While you were speaking, the chat got quite active. So I've seen that some via the chat, some participants wanted to ask a question. So first of all, I would like to ask Natalie Ruloda. I saw that you raised the hand at the very beginning during the presentation of, at the end of, sorry, of the presentation of the UN Special Rapporteur, but there was no possibility for me to give you the floor. So I wanted to ask you if you would like to raise your question now, please raise the hand, and I will be giving the floor to you. But I've seen that Violelia Rosu and also Amala Obikoyev-Navloren, again, apologies for my pronunciation, have raised the hand. So, Violelia, you have the floor. Kindly shortly introduce yourself and try to be concise since the time is running. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, my name
Yes, we hear you. We hear you quite far away. Maybe if you could try just to raise a bit the volume of your mic, if that's possible, or just speak very loud, please.
now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Grazia Giammarinaro. I'm a gender anti-trafficking officer at the OEC office in Tajikistan. First of all, I'd like to thank ICMPD for approaching this issue, this very quite difficult issue on exploring the link between human trafficking and recruiting people for joining the fighters in ISIS. It's also a quite sensitive issue. So thank you, Claire, for explaining the vulnerabilities and the situation with people who are on the move and who may be in risky situation to become victims. Indeed, these two phenomena that I mentioned, they are different, but still we can see the connections and nexus. And since these phenomena are hidden phenomena, it's very difficult to study the connection. But one of the link that we definitely can observe is the link that indirect link, let's say, of the people who are directly involved, being involved in these terroristic activities. For example, the wives and children of fighters who joined them traveling to Syria, and when their husbands are killed, they became victims of exploitation. And as you can imagine, the cases that we know, that we get to know, the deaths of top of the iceberg, yes. And I can share with you quickly several examples from Tajikistan here that we observed from mass media sources. It's several cases. First of all, about 1,000 citizens of Tajikistan have been officially declared that they joined the fights in Syria. Most of them bring their wives and children. And several cases that have been officially reported, for example, 12 Tajik women who have escaped by mystery from the exploitation, and one woman told that her husband took her promising traveling as a tourist in Turkey, but they finally got Syria, and when her husband died, her passport had been taken away and destroyed, and she was forced to a marriage with another man in Syria. Also, there are cases reported in the mass media when Tajik women they meet men through internet, through social networks, and they are fraudulently invited to marry them and to travel to Turkey, and then they are brought to Syria. There are also cases when Tajik citizens, young men, just 18 years old, they traveled to Russia and they became vulnerable they lose their jobs, and special groups, terroristic groups, recruiters, they promise them a job as fighters, but actually they exploit it in the war in Syria. The analysis of my colleagues from Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and also Central Asia, they also report in the media cases when the women are fraudulently recruited and they used as sexual slaves in Syria, and also used as bombs in these countries. In Uzbekistan, women reported, they testified that there are many Uzbek women who agreed to serve as intimate jihad in Syria. So all of them have been recruited through internet, and they have been forced to marry the fighters in Syria. Well, as you see, there are cases, there are really not so many cases, and that is why it's important to conduct these studies, research, and to document, I guess, from all of the countries who identify these cases, trafficking cases, people exploited in Syria, in order to see the connections and to learn better the way how people are actually recruited for this, because if we...
Aurelia, sorry for interrupting you, but we don't have much time left, and I see that there are also other participants that would like to raise their raise questions. So I would like to ask you to please share what you just said about different countries in Central Asia. If you have any report or information to be shared, maybe via links, via the chat, that would be extremely beneficial. And I would just like to give the floor to Claire if she just would like to comment or react to what you have just said now. And again, apologies for interrupting you, but time is running.
Yes, I understand. Just to thank you again for continuous work on researching the links. Thank you, Claire, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, Aurelia, and for your excellent feedback and very interesting comments. I think that it's a central question that we are all finally paying attention to, the extent to which terrorist activities may involve some form of trafficking or exploitation, even at its most extreme form when it manifests itself as you know, a suicide bombing. Central Asia, of course, is a very important source region for foreign fighters joining Islamist groups in Syria and Iraq. I think together with Saudi Arabia and Jordan, some of the most important origin countries are in Central Asia, and so it's very important to understand to what extent any of this activity, both for the young men and for women and children, is voluntarily or is actually a form of exploitation. One maybe relevant case that we found in the research from within Syria was one particular town that was under siege by the regime, and the town itself was controlled by an Islamist group, Jaish al-Islam, and people had no access to any means of survival. And so in order for families to survive, some boys and young men were joining this Islamist group, not because they believed in it, not because they wanted to fight, but because it was the only way to get any food or any money for their families. So these kind of cases, I think we need to understand them a lot better. So thank you very much for raising that. I'll give it back to whoever wants to ask the next question. Thanks again, Aurelia.
Yeah, thank you, Claire, and thank you again, Aurelia. I saw Amala raise her hand. Please, Amala, the floor is yours. Just enable your mic, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Perfectly. Yes, Amala, we hear you very well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Claire, for your presentation. It was captivating, as Elisa said, and well done on getting the report published, and all the best in the next steps. I have first a comment just in line with what the last speaker talked about, being people being exploited because of their situation. Like in Nigeria, for instance, we've read, though we don't have hard data, but we've read in the newspapers and we watch on TV about people joining the Boko Haram insurgents because they don't have a job or they're poor. So what's the best other option is to join. And we also read reports of fathers selling their young children, especially female children, to Boko Haram insurgents, and they are eventually used as suicide bombers or married off to insurgents. So these are some of the situations, things happening because of the crisis, people being exploited because of their vulnerabilities. So let me quickly go to my questions because I know we don't have a lot of time. Specifically on the report, I wanted to understand a little about the baseline period, because I know initially, my initial understanding was that the baseline period is 2011 to 2015. Then in between, I saw that a baseline of 2001 to 2010. So it was a bit confusing. What is the specific baseline period? Is it 2011 to 2015 or 2001 to 2010? And in addition, when on the slide that talked about the baseline of 2001 to 2010, you talked about countries of origin of people trafficked. So are they countries of origin people trafficked to Syria, or what was the destination? It wasn't very clear to me. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you, Amal. I would give the floor to Claire because definitely she's the most appropriate person to give you an answer.
Okay. I have two more questions. Can I quickly ask them? Yes?
Very, because the time is running.
Okay, then very quickly, the next question is, we mentioned that some countries like Lebanon ask UNHCR to stop taking the data. In that case, on which basis would they use for policy making, for allocating aid if there is no data on refugees coming in? Then the last question is, you talked about the fact that Turkey has no refugee, did not ratify the Convention on Refugee Status. In that case, what is the status of the Syrians? As you said, they have the highest number of Syrians. And with the deal with Europe now, a lot more of these migrants or refugees coming into Europe will be sent back to Turkey. So what is going to be their status? I don't know, how is it going to work? Then finally, one last question, sorry, quickly. You talked about sexual exploitation through forced marriage. At which point is it termed sexual exploitation? Is it if there is a divorce after a number of years? But what if the marriage continues and they live on? At which point, how do you define it as an exploitation because it was forced marriage? Because staying in Nigeria, a lot of people marry before the age of 18. Some of them live on with their husbands and have grandchildren. Some people get divorced early. What is the...
Thank you very much. I have to give the floor to Claire because actually these are four questions and she would need some time also to get back to you. So Claire, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamala. Really interesting questions, and let me try to get through them. Indeed, the situation of, fathers in a very desperate situation selling their daughters into forced marriage, or people being involved in terrorism and suicide bombings. There are many parallels between the situation in Syria and the hosting countries and the situation in Nigeria, Niger, Chad and Cameroon with the Boko Haram insurgency. So I think there's a lot of lessons there. Of course, you hear stories all the time from West and Central Africa of very young girls being involved in suicide bombings, where of course that could be an indicator is most probably an indicator of trafficking. In relation just to your question on the baseline versus the impact, the baseline period for us was the period before the war, because that was the situation against which we were comparing what has happened since. So 2001 to 2000 and to the end of 2010 was the baseline period, so that we knew what we were comparing when we started to look at the effects of the war since 2011. So just to clarify that. The countries of origin that I mentioned for trafficking victims during that period, those were the countries of origin of victims in all 5 countries under study. So throughout our study, as you'll see, we cover all 5 countries. So that's what it refers to. And then the last 2 questions I think particularly interesting. So Lebanon is in a very particular situation. Before the Syrian conflict happened, Syrians had free movement, had free access to Lebanon. They were allowed to migrate there, work there. Lebanon was already host to a high population of Palestinian refugees who were in 11 camps throughout Lebanon, was also recovering from the impact of the civil war. And so it places Lebanon in a very difficult situation to have this high number of Syrian refugees. They feel completely overwhelmed. It doesn't seem possible to have so many, and so they have stopped registering any more people. I think this is something that needs to be a shared responsibility for the international community, for all safe countries, is to recognize that that's an extremely difficult situation and to work on improving the situation of Syrians in Lebanon and those who will need to be resettled outside of Lebanon. That's the situation there. In Turkey, the situation is slightly different. Turkey set up a special program specifically for those fleeing the Syrian war. It applies to everybody fleeing Syria, not just Syrian citizens. It's referred to as temporary protection. Under temporary protection, Syrians and others have certain rights. Children have rights to education. They have certain subsistence rights and so on. As I mentioned, the minority of them are living in official camps. The good news then is that since January, they've been entitled to also apply for a work permit. We need to see now if the implementation of the work permit goes well, but that should improve the situation. I don't feel knowledgeable enough to comment on what the implications will be for the EU-Turkey agreement. I know there's a very low level of implementation. It's not really working at the moment. It's not really being applied, but the temporary protection procedures in Turkey, it's important to note, only apply to those fleeing the Syrian conflict. So for any Afghanistanis, Eritreans, Somalians who might be sent from Europe, returned from Europe to Turkey, they would not fall under these temporary protection regulations, and they wouldn't fall under UN Convention refugee status in Turkey, because that only applies to European citizens. Also what you mentioned about sexual exploitation by means of forced marriage. Trafficking for forced marriage we refer to as a situation when somebody is exploiting, usually a girl or a woman, making money from their marriage. When a forced or temporary marriage is used as a means of sexual exploitation, and so the profit is really being made from the sexual exploitation, that's where we say it's trafficking for sexual exploitation by means of forced marriage. As you'll see in the study, not all early marriages or not all child marriages are actually forced marriages or trafficking for forced marriages. So you have to be very specific in relation to what you're talking about. And we found various situations of child marriage, situations of trafficking for forced marriage, and situations of trafficking for sexual exploitation by means of forced marriage, very often using these temporary forms of marriage in certain Sunni and Shia Muslim communities, Mishar and Muta, abusing these forms of temporary marriage in order to exploit or abuse people.
Claire, thank you very much for answering to the questions of Amala in such a concise manner. We started a little bit late, so I would still like to ask to the remaining participants, if you would like still to ask one question to Claire, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, we will have to just move towards the, let's say, the final part of this webinar. I see that Annie, via chat, asked a question. So Claire, if you have access to the chat, maybe could you get back to her question? Claire?
Sorry, I was actually just checking exactly where that was. Yes, in fact, in each of the
Hello? I think there is a technical I think there is a technical problem because I think we lost Claire. Claire, could you just try to reconnect in case you
Hi,
are
I'm
there?
back. Sorry, I lost my connection completely. Sorry.
Good. Yeah, please go
I
ahead.
dropped out, but I'm back. Yeah, I was just actually checking the precise part of the study where it is, but in chapter 5, when we go through the different forms of trafficking where we encountered indications in the research, for each form of trafficking, we also explain exactly what we mean. So for us, for example, child labor or early marriage, these are forms of child protection issues, the child protection concerns and violations, and we cover them under vulnerabilities. When it comes to trafficking, we look at actual trafficking for forced marriage or child trafficking for labor exploitation or worst forms of child labor. So you will indeed find the specific definitions in chapter 5 of these different forms of trafficking. Also in the very first chapter of the study, you'll see our working definitions as well. So I hope that would also be useful.
Thank you, Claire, for this clarification. I think we are about to close this session, but Claire, I wanted to ask you if you would like still to have some concluding remarks, also in the light of to what Maria Grazia has said before you. I find it quite interesting that some of the vulnerabilities that you have analyzed in the Targeting Vulnerability study are actually very relevant to many other war and refugee situations, as also mentioned by Maria Grazia. Maybe would you like to leave us with a last comment from your side?
Yes, thank you, Elisa. Yeah, I think that the experience of doing this research over the past 2 years was extremely challenging for all of us involved, particularly because doing this kind of research while a conflict is ongoing, while a displacement crisis is ongoing, it hadn't really been done in this way before, and it was very difficult, but we also we tried to do it as quickly as possible because we don't accept that this situation should continue. And so for this conflict, and I think also for future conflicts or for ongoing conflicts in other regions, it's clear that there are implications in terms of human rights violations in general and specifically in terms of trafficking. What's really welcome, what's very good to see, and I think the Special Rapporteur mentioned this at the beginning of her speech as well. So for any of you who might have missed that, it's important to note that a lot of organizations, a lot of stakeholders are now recognizing this, that we can't respond to a conflict or a displacement situation without also having an anti-trafficking response in place. The International Organization for Migration recently issued a report on this, on responding to trafficking in situations of conflict and natural disasters. The Special Rapporteur herself has tried to place focus on this, and I think it's rare as a researcher to say this, but I think we don't need much more research, particularly on this conflict at this point. We need to respond. We need to act on the recommendations. We need to focus on giving people access to their basic needs so they're not in situations of vulnerability to trafficking. And I think that was kind of the innovation, I suppose, of the research that we did, is that one, we can access this information. It is possible to conduct an analysis even with this challenging situation. And secondly, yes, there is a very strong evidence base for us to respond. And in the study, we've tried to indicate what those responses should look like. And the next step is on all of our shoulders as stakeholders to respond in the best way to prevent people from ending up in this situation and to adequately respond when they do. So thank you very much to all participants. It's been really interesting having the opportunity to discuss this with you today.
Thank you, Claire. I would like just to close this webinar with just maybe one more remark that when I think about what Maria Grazia and then Claire have said, we cannot keep making the excuse of thinking that the Syrian war and the refugee situation is just a temporary one. And the factors that will contribute to the incidence of trafficking in human beings among the vulnerable populations and the groups we have been mentioning throughout our discussion are already clearly in evidence. And I believe that this is by using this knowledge and also discussions like this one today that we will contribute to make a step further in addressing these problems and eventually also to reduce the likelihood of trafficking cases in the future. I would like now to thank all those that contributed to this webinar today. First and foremost, Claire and Maria Grazia for sharing expertise. It's always a pleasure listening to you, and we always learn something new. And also would like to thank all of you participants. I saw some of you left already for taking the opportunity to share your also knowledge and also to be interactive throughout the discussion. I also would like to thank my colleague Elena and our IT support here in Vienna for mastering the technical aspects of this webinar. Just last instructions from my side. First of all, you will be asked for a very simple question. Your opinion matters a lot to us. So by clicking one of the multiple choices that will appear after I will finally say goodbye, you will be at the poll. I see it's here. So please just take a few seconds to answer to the poll. The chat option will be open for the next hour. So all of you can still discuss further if needed. Claire will be there and I will be there. So please go ahead if you were too shy to raise your hands and ask questions via the mic. As I said at the beginning, the file will be, there's a recorded file of this webinar will be uploaded for further use. So also the publications that Claire mentioned and also Melita was mentioning other issues via the chat are available to be downloaded on our website, www.icmpd.org, and also check other additional information available via Storyfile. So again, thank you all for taking part in this webinar and goodbye.